detour sign was the first thing that felt off. I had been driving through endless farmland, the faint glow of my GPS guiding me to a weekend getaway in Cedar Bluff. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from the chaos of work, but nothing about the drive felt relaxing now. When I turned onto the narrow road marked by the detour, the pavement changed to gravel, and the horizon seemed to blur into darkness. My phone service had cut out miles ago, and the isolation was starting to wear on me. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. The headlights lit up the gravel road as it snaked between dense rows of trees. The air outside was heavy, the kind of stillness that made every little sound feel amplified. Then I saw the truck. It was parked on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, its front end slightly tilted into the ditch. The truck was old, with rust eating away at the paint, and the driver's side door was open. I slowed down as I approached, scanning for any sign of the driver. A man stepped out of the shadows, waving one arm as he walked toward my car. Hey, can you stop?" he called out, his voice loud in the quiet night. I pulled to a stop a few feet away, gripping the wheel tightly. His clothes were dirty, and his jacket hung loosely from his thin frame. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder, and his other hand was shoved deep into his pocket. "What's going on?" I asked, rolling the window down just enough for him to hear me. "My truck's stuck," he said, pointing toward the ditch. "I've been out here for hours. Can you give me a ride?" I hesitated, glancing at the truck again. The open door and flashing lights made the scene feel staged, like something wasn't adding up. But the man looked genuinely desperate, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "Where are you headed?" I asked. "Just up the road," he said quickly. "The next town, anywhere but here." Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door. "Hop in," I said. He climbed in without a word, setting his backpack on the floor between his feet. The smell of sweat and gasoline filled the car as I pulled back onto the road. We drove in silence for a while, the tension in the car thick. I kept stealing glances at him. His hands were clasped tightly, his eyes darting between me and the road ahead. "What were you doing out here?" I asked, trying to break the silence. "Driving to see family," he said, his voice clipped. "Truck broke down." I nodded, not wanting to press further, but something about his demeanor set me on edge. The road twisted and turned, the trees on either side growing denser. The GPS had long since stopped providing directions, and I was relying on my memory to navigate. Then, without warning, the man spoke again. "Do you ever think about what you'd do if something went wrong?" he asked, his tone unsettlingly casual. "What do you mean?" I asked, my grip on the wheel tightening. "Like if you broke down out here, middle of nowhere, no one around to help." He turned to look at me, a strange smile creeping across his face. "I try not to think about it," I said, forcing a laugh. He didn't respond, just kept staring out the window. The silence that followed was worse than the conversation. I felt trapped, the car suddenly too small. Then I saw the lights ahead. A gas station, the first sign of civilization I'd seen in hours. I pulled in, relieved to have an excuse to stop. "I need to fill up," I said, parking near the pump. "I'll wait here," he said, his voice low. I got out, the cold air a welcome relief. The attendant inside waved at me, and I hurried toward the door. As I entered, I glanced back at the car. The man was still sitting there, his face obscured in the shadows. "You're out late," the attendant said, his tone friendly but cautious. "Not many folks take this road." "I got rerouted," I explained, glancing over my shoulder. "Picked up a guy whose truck broke down. He seemed stranded." The attendant's expression changed instantly. "A truck? What kind?" "An old one, rusted, red, I think." He shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "That truck's been out there for weeks, no one's driving it." The words hit me like a punch. "What do you mean?" "State troopers checked it out days ago. Whoever left it there never came back." My blood ran cold. I turned back to the car, but the passenger seat was empty. The door was open, and the man was gone. The attendant grabbed a phone. "Stay inside," he said firmly. "I'll call the police." I didn't argue. My eyes scanned the dark road beyond the gas station, searching for any sign of him, but there was nothing, just the empty highway stretching into the night. I had been planning this road trip for months. The idea was simple: 3 days on the road, just me, my car, and the sprawling highways of the Midwest. The goal was to clear my head after a brutal breakup and reconnect with the kind of solitude only long stretches of empty road could provide. It started perfectly. Open skies, a playlist of my favorite songs, and endless miles of rolling plains. But by the second day, things started to feel off. It was mid-afternoon when I first noticed it. I had been driving along a particularly empty stretch of highway in Kansas. The road cut through fields that seemed to go on forever, with no towns or houses in sight. I hadn't passed another car in over an hour, when in the rearview mirror I saw headlights. At first I felt relief. Someone else was out here. But the relief quickly turned to unease as the vehicle stayed far behind, just a speck on the horizon. It didn't get closer or fall away, it just lingered, keeping pace with me. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just taking it slow, like I was. Still, every time I glanced in the mirror, those headlights were there, unwavering. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to pull over at a rest stop I'd spotted on a mile marker sign. It wasn't much, just a gravel lot with a single picnic table and an aging bathroom, but it was a chance to stretch my legs. I parked and stepped out, the dry wind brushing against my face. The highway was silent except for the faint hum of cicadas. I leaned against the hood of my car, sipping water from a bottle and watching the horizon. That's when I saw it. The same car. A beat-up sedan pulling off the road and into the rest stop. My stomach knotted. There was no reason for them to stop here. The highway stretched on for miles without another break. Yet, here they were. The car parked at the opposite end of the lot, and for a few moments, nothing happened. I couldn't see the driver through the darkened windshield, but I felt their eyes on me. Trying to play it cool, I climbed back into my car and started the engine. I was just being paranoid, I told myself, nothing to worry about. As I pulled back onto the highway, the sedan did the same. For the next hour, they followed me. Sometimes they fell back, their headlights barely visible, and other times they inched closer until I could see the faint outline of the driver in my mirror. I considered calling the police, but my phone had no signal out here. The isolation that had felt so freeing that morning now felt suffocating. Finally, I spotted an exit for a small town and took it, hoping to lose them. The road wound through a cluster of buildings that barely qualified as a town, a gas station, a diner, a handful of houses. I pulled into the gas station, my heart pounding. The sedan didn't follow. I watched as it continued down the road, disappearing into the distance. Relief washed over me. I was overreacting, I thought. It was just a coincidence. Inside the gas station, I grabbed a coffee and tried to shake off the lingering unease. The clerk, a wiry man in his 60s, glanced at me as I paid. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just a long day on the road." He grunted, handing me my change. "Careful out there. Not much between here and the next town, and folks around here don't like strangers poking around." I wasn't sure what to make of his comment, but I thanked him and left. As I got back into my car, the night had fallen completely, the darkness pressing in around me. I told myself I'd drive another hour and then find a motel. Back on the highway, the road felt even more desolate. The world beyond my headlights was impenetrable black, and I was acutely aware of how alone I was. Then, in the mirror, I saw them again. The sedan's headlights appeared on the horizon, growing steadily closer. My chest tightened as they gained on me, This time, there was no doubt. They were following me. I pushed the accelerator, my car surging forward, but the sedan matched my speed. They stayed close, their high beams flooding my car with light, making it hard to see. I veered into the oncoming lane to try to create space, but they swerved in tandem, keeping pace. Up ahead, I saw a turnoff for a dirt road and took it without thinking. The sedan's headlights disappeared as I tore down the bumpy path, my tires kicking up dust. I drove for what felt like miles, twisting and turning until I was sure I'd lost them. Finally, I came to a stop in a small clearing, cutting the engine and sitting in the silence, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Then, faintly, I saw them again. The headlights appeared at the top of the hill, slowly descending toward me. My blood turned to ice. I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen remained blank. There was no one to call, no one to help. The headlights grew closer, illuminating the trees around me. Suddenly, the sedan stopped, its lights cutting out. The world plunged into darkness. I sat frozen, every nerve on edge, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The sound of a car door opening echoed through the night, followed by footsteps crunching on gravel. I didn't wait to find out who they were or what they wanted. Slamming the car into reverse, I tore back down the dirt road, my tires skidding wildly. I hit the highway at full speed, not daring to look back. When I finally reached a motel hours later, I locked the door and sat by the window watching the parking lot until dawn. The sedan never appeared, but the fear lingered. To this day, I don't know who was following me or why. Road trips were my therapy. Whenever life got too overwhelming, I'd pack up my car, pick a random destination on the map, and hit the road. This time, I chose to drive up the Pacific Northwest, following winding roads through dense forests and quiet coastal towns. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to clear my head. Instead, it turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. It started on the second day. I had spent the night at a small motel near Astoria and left early, hoping to reach a secluded trailhead I'd read about online. The drive was stunning, tall evergreens lining the road, mist clinging to the branches. But as the morning stretched on, the road grew narrower and less maintained. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour when I came across a battered sign, Willow Creek Campground, 5 miles. I hadn't planned on stopping, but something about the sign intrigued me. A quiet campground sounded like a good spot to stretch my legs and maybe take a short hike. I turned onto the dirt road, the tires of my car crunching over gravel. The trees grew denser, their shadows swallowing the sunlight, and the further I drove, the more isolated I felt. When I reached the campground, it was completely empty. A few picnic tables and fire pits were scattered around, but there were no tents, no people, no sounds other than the occasional chirp of a bird. I parked my car near the entrance and stepped out, breathing in the cool, damp air. As I walked toward the nearest picnic table, I noticed something odd. A backpack was sitting on the ground, partially unzipped. It looked like it had been left in a hurry, the contents spilling out: a water bottle, a map, a flashlight. But there was no one around. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. No response. I walked closer to the backpack, scanning the area. That's when I saw the notebook. It was lying a few feet away, the pages fluttering in the breeze. Curious, I picked it up and flipped through it. Most of the entries were mundane. Lists of supplies, directions, notes about hiking trails. But the last page made my stomach drop. Someone's following me. I don't know who they are, but they keep showing up. At the trailhead, by the creek, watching, always watching. If you find this, get out. I looked around, my heart pounding. The forest felt different now, the trees oppressive, the silence menacing. I dropped the notebook and hurried back to my car, my eyes darting to the shadows. When I reached the driver's seat and locked the doors, I felt a small wave of relief. That relief was short-lived. As I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic began to creep in as I checked my phone. No service. I sat there for a moment trying to think. Maybe I'd flooded the engine. I'd wait a few minutes and try again. But then I saw it. Movement in the trees. A figure just on the edge of my vision. They were standing between the trunks far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but close enough to know they were watching me. My breath hitched as I stared at the figure. They didn't move. They didn't wave. They just stood there, completely still. I turned the key again, my hands shaking. The engine roared to life this time, and I slammed my foot on the gas, peeling out of the campground. As I sped down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see the figure chasing after me. But the road was empty. When I finally reached the main highway, I didn't stop. I drove straight through to the next town, where I found a mechanic to look at my car. The mechanic didn't find anything wrong. "Starts up fine," he said, giving me a strange look. "Maybe you just panicked." Maybe I did. But even now, I can't forget the stillness of that figure in the trees, the way they watched me without moving. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I haven't been on a road trip since. Some roads, I've learned, are better left unexplored. I'm not the kind of person who scares easily. I've driven across the country more times than I can count, often taking the back roads just for the thrill of it. But this trip, a simple drive from Dallas to El Paso, was different. I've never been one to shy away from solitude, but what happened that night made me rethink being alone on the open road. It was nearing 10 p.m. when I stopped at a small gas station in the middle of nowhere. The place was dimly lit, with one flickering bulb above the pump and a single attendant inside who barely looked up from his magazine as I paid for gas and grabbed a coffee. I asked him if there was anything open ahead, maybe a diner or even a motel. He shook his head. "Not for another 50 miles or so," he said. "Best just keep going." I thanked him and got back on the road, the coffee doing little to stave off the creeping exhaustion. The highway was dark and empty, the kind of pitch black where your headlights barely seem to make a dent. It was quiet too, except for the faint hum of the engine and the occasional thud of a bug hitting the windshield. About 30 minutes later, I saw it, a car on the side of the road, hazard lights flashing. As I got closer, I could make out a man standing next to the car, waving his arms. He was wearing a jacket that looked too thin for the cool desert air, and his posture was frantic. My first thought was to stop. It's what any decent person would do, right? But something held me back. Maybe it was the way he waved, too desperate, almost theatrical. Or maybe it was the way the car looked, old and beat up, but with no visible damage. No flat tire, no smoke from the hood. Something about it just didn't feel right. I kept driving, my grip on the wheel tightening as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man lowered his arms as I passed, and for a moment I thought I saw him smile. Not a grateful smile, but something else. A knowing, unsettling grin. I told myself I was overthinking it, but the unease lingered. A few miles down the road, I noticed headlights in the distance behind me. They were faint at first, but they grew closer quickly, too quickly. The car caught up to me within minutes, its high beams flooding my rearview mirror. I slowed down, hoping they'd pass, but they didn't. Instead, they stayed right on my tail, their lights so bright I had to squint to see the road ahead. I tapped my brakes lightly, a warning to back off. It didn't work. The car swerved slightly, then pulled up alongside me. For a moment, we were driving side by side, and I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was the man from the side of the road. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was blank, almost robotic, and his hands gripped the wheel tightly. Then, without warning, he swerved toward me. I yanked my wheel to the right, narrowly avoiding the collision, and hit the gas. My little sedan wasn't built for speed, but I pushed it as hard as I could, the engine roaring in protest. The car stayed with me, its headlights bouncing in my mirrors as we tore down the highway. My heart pounded as I scanned the road for any sign of help, a gas station, a rest stop, anything. But there was nothing, just miles of empty desert and the relentless pursuit of the car behind me. Finally, I saw it, a green sign that read, "Rest area, 1 mile." I didn't know if it would help, but it was my only option. I took the exit at full speed, my tires screeching as I pulled into the lot. The rest area was deserted, but it was well lit, with a row of vending machines and a payphone. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as the line connected. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. There's a man following me, I said, breathless. He tried to run me off the road. I'm at the rest area off Highway 10. Stay where you are, the operator said. A patrol car is on its way. Can you see the other vehicle? I turned, scanning the lot. The car wasn't there. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd lost him, but then I saw it. The headlights were off, but the car was parked at the far end of the lot, its silhouette barely visible in the shadows. He's here, I whispered. Stay in your car and lock the doors, the operator instructed. I did as she said, my pulse racing. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, my eyes glued to the other car. The man didn't get out. He just sat there, staring at me, his figure barely discernible in the darkness. Finally, red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as the patrol car pulled into the lot. The man's car roared to life and sped off before the officers could block him in. They chased after him, but when one officer stayed behind to check on me, I knew they hadn't caught him. The officer took my statement and offered to escort me to the nearest town. I didn't argue. By the time I checked into a motel, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me exhausted and shaken. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted. The officers said they'd keep an eye out, but part of me knew he'd disappear into the night, just another shadow on the endless highway. These days, I stick to the interstates. The open road doesn't feel so freeing anymore.